Hi there, this is Jana Rose of the Rose Compass podcast. Um, and the topic today is the divine feminine and the divine masculine. And my guest is, and I'm going to say your whole beautiful name, Julius Q Holmes the Fourth, who is the owner of Modernized Engaged Learning Training Company that works with career advancement, business development, and relationship development. And Julius and I met through some networking and realized as we were talking that we're on very similar spiritual paths. Both of us are interested in these concepts of the masculine and the feminine, thinking about the divine in relationship to that, how that works in relationships, how it works in society. And so we decided we would love to have a conversation about these topics. So thank you so much for coming to this episode, Julius, taking time.
Absolutely, no problem at all.
Thanks. So I'm going to start just because I always do with some Palo Santo. It's a little shaman in me. Clear the air, and it smells good. So you tell me, Julius, if you can feel the Palo Santo energy through the computer.
Well, I did sage this morning, so I'm definitely on sage vibes.
Are you?
Sage.
Yeah. Yeah, I love it. It just smells good. It feels good. And I always start with it. I'm going to light a candle for us too, because I'm all about the sensual, which is exactly what I'm going to start off talking a little bit about. So to start off our conversation, I wanted to read a poem from this really wonderful book I have called Love Poems from God. And it's a collection of a lot of mystics from all different traditions, all different spiritual traditions. And this one is from Meera in India. She was, let me see what her year was real quick. So her years were 1498 to 1550. So she's a few centuries old here. And this is called, I Want You to Have This. So the poem is, I want you to have this, all the beauty in my eyes, all the grace of my mouth, all the splendor of my strength, all the wonder of the musk parts of my body. For are we not talking about real love? Real love. I feel like she has a little Father John Misty in there with that real love song. But I thought I loved that poem because it has that sensual aspect, and she's talking about the divine. And I think that for me, on my own spiritual journey, I've been really trying to explore this question of the sensual and the sacred. So do you want to share a little bit about your kind of spiritual journey and what led you to exploring what the divine masculine is?
Sure. I mean, and I'll be very candid here, but for me, I was exposed to pornography pretty young, and from there, kind of developed, a dependence on it. Right, as far as times I'm, bored, anxious, lonely, angry, stressed, tired, whatever it was, that's kind of what I turned to. And when I got into college, it really kind of began to accelerate. And so I went and got a lot of help for it. And so my spiritual journey was really about how do I move past this dependency. And as I kind of matriculated through that recovery process, I came to realize that I had a high level of resentment towards masculinity. Because in my head, I saw all of the world's problems stemming from imbalanced masculinity, right? The desire to control, the desire to lead, to dominate, causes all the problems in the world. And so it was a journey for me to recognize that resentment and bit by bit begin to, I guess, heal that so that I can begin to understand, okay, no, this isn't masculinity. This is imbalanced, toxic masculinity, and divine masculinity is something totally different.
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the things I think is admirable about what you're doing and exploring is that a lot of people who might have similarly grown up on a lot of pornography or turn to it in times of stress they don't often admit that they wouldn't necessarily admit that. And I think that that's an admirable trait because it is so ubiquitous. It is so common. It is so everywhere. And it is something that, so I'm starting with, and I think I told you this in a separate conversation, surrogate partner therapy, which is dealing with men and women, but mostly men who struggle with all kinds of issues related to sexuality And one of those issues is that, you know, they've developed a dependence on pornography, and then when it comes time to actual intimacy with a partner, they struggle with how to engage in real life, after having witnessed so many sexual interactions virtually and
Mhm.
through screens. And if you do grow up with that, I mean, there's even books being written now. I think Peggy Orenstein has written one about teenage boys and the difficulty they might face with having relationships with women if
Right.
they've, you know, just watched a lot of pornography. So it's definitely a kind of epidemic in our society because it's so available. And it really does force us to start asking questions about what does sex mean to us? What does intimacy mean? And what does being masculine mean? What does being feminine mean? And what are we called to do now that we're in this situation and we're living in this kind of world? How do we move forward with that? What are the lessons we can learn? What can we teach people about how to operate within that framework that's sort of changing and that's not always the most healthy? But every age has its issues, right? And this is just the one that we're sort of in the midst of now. So, what did you find when you started to explore masculinity and questions about masculinity, the positive traits that we don't maybe often hear about?
So the positive traits are really the traits that you have heard about, but just balanced, right?
Yeah.
So that the leadership is a part of masculinity, right? Logic is a part of masculinity. The desire to control is a part of masculinity. A deep connection to God is a part of masculinity. The things that you already see every day when you interact with men, it's just they're in better proportion, right? There's lots of elements out there that if you get them in the wrong proportion, they become poisonous. They're not poisonous by themselves, but if you take too much or take too little, then it becomes an issue. It's the same thing with masculine energy. If you move too far left, too far right, that's where you kind of get all the issues. But I found it's the things I kind of already knew were just back in balance and from a place of love and connection instead of from a place of ego or a place of kind of selfishness or self-serving place.
Yeah. And I think that word ego is a really important distinction because that is one of those assumptions that we make or one of those stereotypes. You know, we talk about the male ego. We have these, you know, phrases about men having fragile egos and things like that. And obviously women have egos as well. But there's, you know, I guess like a, a heart-centeredness that maybe is helpful to think about for both the masculine and the feminine. But would you agree? Now, let me ask you this because I want to talk a little bit about the feminine too. But um, is there more of a sense that the masculine is tied to the head and that the feminine is tied to the heart, or do you see there being a balance of the two in your exploration?
So, from my experience, it is men tend to be more logical, women tend to be emotional. And when I say emotional, I think there's historically been a lot of negative connotations about that, like, oh, women are out of control and this is bad and blah, blah, blah. That is the masculine or toxic masculinity oppressing and demonizing the feminine, right? And so, the easiest way that I found in this book called The Way of the Superior Man to describe the two was that women are like the ocean, right? They're deep, they're waves, they're just this movement of like emotion, and men are the boat on the ocean, right? So men are trying to go from point A to point B. Women aren't as concerned about trying to go from point A to, I shouldn't say women, but feminine energy is not as concerned about going to point A to point B. It's more just about being, existing, and flowing and being one with nature. So, the masculine, as far as the logical and the rational and, achievement oriented, point A, point B, and feminine, more experiential, more the flow of connection, of love, and just being for the sake of being.
Yeah. And what's interesting about that, and I would agree with you in those regards, and I think the more that I've practiced, you know, on my spiritual path, um, and I can share a little bit about that in a minute, but the more that I've sort of evolved in that path and gotten in touch with my own feminine energy in a way that I wasn't previously, um, I've really come to value those masculine energy traits. You know, I've come to, the more I've wanted to explore that fluidity and that, flow, the more I've realized that in order to have balance, it's helpful to have somebody who is thinking of point A to point B, because you want that when you're sort of in your, fluid space, and you're trying to operate in an existence and in a culture that's not really conducive to a fluid and flowing space.
Right.
um, there's been more of for me, a respect of that person who's logical and thinking of a point A to point B. Now, I am very logical and I can think very well in point A to point B,
Mhm.
but there are times when I want to surrender to that feminine energy, and it's challenging to do that in a culture when it's not really respected and it's not really honored. And I'm a single person raising children, you know what I mean? So I have to sort of adopt both. And so that's something I wanted to address with you a little bit too. So in terms of my own spiritual path, I was raised by a single mother and did not have my father in my life. I did have a stepfather for a time, but that wasn't really a positive, experience or role model of male energy in any way. And so mostly I look at my upbringing as having a single mother who was trying to balance, um, a whole lot, without necessarily the kind of support or system that was in place that would help her to do that. And so it was challenging for her. And that obviously had a big impression on me. And what it did for me was made me, I think, a little more intense in my masculine energy, which she had to be in order to function, right? She needed to raise kids and pay bills and work and, sort of be a manager of the house in that way. And so I think that I didn't necessarily know what feminine energy was. And there was also a lot of fear around being feminine in my upbringing, because if you were feminine and soft and emotional and sensual, those things were very daring and sort of scary to own, because you had to sort of work and you had to get things done and you had to accomplish so that you could make a better life than the one that you had come from, right? And so there was a lot of, for me, an out of balance in the logic, um, the suppression of emotion, a lot of anxiety about accomplishing and achieving. And that idea of surrender and flowing is just not something I learned until I started to tap into yoga and meditation. And it wasn't until that experience that I started to recognize that there was something sacred and beautiful in the letting go and the surrendering and the letting flow. But I hadn't known how to do that because I had to check all the boxes, get everything in order, manage my life, right? And so I didn't really necessarily see how those two things could function at the same time, the surrender piece and the management and the logic that was required to live my life.
And I think your story, I think a lot of people would relate to. And I want to be very clear that as I comment on this, I was raised in a two-parent household, and I'm married now, and so I'm very cautious to comment on things that I don't have direct experience with. So I'll preamble what I'm going to say with that, right? But I will toss this out there that everyone is a combination of masculine and feminine energy, right? So it's not like you're a woman, so you have 100% feminine energy and zero masculine, and you're a man, so you have 100% masculine and 0% feminine. That's not true. Everyone has a degree of each, right? And so for me in my journey, it's just been about finding my individual balance and honoring both aspects of that, right? And to speak to your situation, I mean, survival, I mean, is a very real concern, and I don't think there's anything wrong with who you are or what you had to do to survive, right? And the thing about even about my experience with addiction, I don't look back on some of those things as negative so much anymore. It's like I had to do what I had to do to survive in that setting. But now those survival techniques aren't what's going to take me to the next level, right? You can't thrive if you're focusing on surviving, right? And so you did what you had to do to survive. That makes absolute total sense, right? And now you're at another level now where it's saying, okay, what do I need to do to thrive? And that includes honoring and reintegrating my feminine energy, if I'm hearing you correctly.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And integrating is the perfect word. I think that was one of the things that I don't, I think that's something that I've been working on in terms of thinking about how do you become an integrated human being who takes all these parts that our society and our culture has told us need to be disparate, like, you know, your sexuality or sensuality is in this box, and then your professionalism is in this box, and then your family and relationships is in this box, and then your spirituality is in this box, right?
Mhm.
Everything's in this, like, the compartmentalized box. and and that leaves people open to things like addiction because they don't feel like they can be their full selves in any area. And I've talked to people who feel like, you know, they call it code switching or shape shifting, or feeling, you know, in this area you wear this mask, and in this area you wear that mask. And I don't think that that's really helpful to the evolution of being a human being that's integrated and that's whole. And most of us deeply desire being whole and being integrated. And so there's something that has to be done, I think, in this new generation, of thinking about how we can honor all those parts of ourselves and come to any situation as our full selves and honor our full selves.
I think that's very profound. And then Carl Jung said, he who looks outside of himself dreams, and he who looks within himself awakens, right? And
Yeah.
so I think a big part is withdrawing a little bit from society, right? It doesn't mean you go live in the mountains somewhere and you become a monk and, you know, throw away all your devices. But it does mean if you're so plugged into what other people are talking about, what other people are thinking, what other people are doing, it's going to be it's going to be this wave of influence that's going to be so hard for you to kind of counteract, right? And so bit by bit, kind of like my process was withdrawing a little bit, and not necessarily being so concerned what's the latest music and what's the latest trends, and not necessarily joining all the social media and being on all the time, because I had to understand myself, and I couldn't do that. You know, how can you hear your own voice if there's 30 people around you talking? So, you know, like I said, however that kind of plays out in the individual life is up to that individual. But, you know, there's so much of kind of like spiritualism that encourages a level of isolation from time to time. And it's very unique that we're in this quarantine right now,
Mhm.
and forced isolation. And a lot of people are having a really hard time with it because they spend so much time looking outside of themselves and very little time looking on the inside. So yeah, no, I absolutely agree with you on that one.
Yeah, yeah, I'm with you. And I have to say that for me, the quarantine is really not a big, you know, it's not a huge adjustment for me because I am very used to looking inward, and to the point that there have been times where I'm like, all right, Jana, that's enough. But you know, yogis would call it self-study. So I've done a lot of that. So I feel very prepared for, you know, that kind of life. And for a little while at least, I do miss my coffee shops and my
Yeah.
cookies and my meeting friends, you know, in person. But so let me ask you, okay, so a little bit about okay, so one of the things I did not address was my own understanding of the masculine and feminine. And I think that I agree with you in terms of what you said about the masculine. You also talked about the feminine as being sort of fluid, going with the flow. Um, we have had conversations where there's about accepting and allowing is kind of a sense of what the feminine is more like, whereas the masculine might be a little more of an asserting or an exerting of some kind, and the
Mhm.
feminine is more of allowing and receiving. Um, and I kind of tie, and this could be my own understanding. I haven't read a book about, you know, what is the feminine energy, but I'm very focused on trying to revive it in some capacity because I think it's been lost and we need the healing energy of the feminine now going forward. But I think of it as intuitive as well. There's you know, not to say that men aren't intuitive, but for some reason I've had growing up as an assumption of women as with intuition. I think you're right as well about there being this association of the emotions, although having 3 kids, I would say that I don't see women as more emotional than men. It's just they might process it differently or share it differently.
Mhm.
I think of beauty as associated with the feminine and the feminine form, and a kind of radiance. Um, and I have a tendency to associate sensuality. Now, I'm not sure that these are mine, right? So I'm not suggesting that these are overarching, but that's what I've sort of associated, and also this element of surrender, um, as associated with the feminine. And so I'm in agreement with you that we all need to sort of embody both of these to function.
Mhm.
But unfortunately, what I think has been happening, and where I think our culture is in a time of shifting, is that, you know, I meant to look up the statistics for single mothers before we met today, just to sort of see, culturally, like, and just, we'll talk about America since we're both in America. Like, what are the numbers of single mothers or something, or something like that? Because I think a lot of single parent households, um, and I know a lot of people who have been raised by single mothers. Now, nowadays, when there's a divorce, there tends to be more of an equitable sharing of the parenting responsibilities.
Mhm.
But for a long time, that wasn't really the case. It was majorly like the mom who might raise the children. And I think those mothers had to adopt some masculine tendencies in order to do that. And then similarly, to make it in the corporate world or the working world, there might have been a lot of women who had to adopt more masculine tendencies. Um, for women to make strides in politics and government, they had to adopt what might be considered more masculine tendencies to do those sorts of things. So I think for a long time, in order for women to make headway in equality, they've had to adopt some of these masculine frameworks and work within them to get the equality, or the move toward equality that we're sort of seeing more of today. But I don't think that men have had to make the same shift in
Oh,
terms of,
absolutely not.
yeah,
Because here's the thing, right? If there is an oppressed group and then there's a group of oppressors, and the oppressed group wants to be successful in the world built by the oppressors, then they naturally have to suppress who they are and adapt qualities of the oppressor, right? And I'm not, and so if masculine has oppressed feminine, which it has, and completely dominated the professional space, then women, to your point, to be successful, have had to adopt masculine traits. And it's the same thing when you look at majority and minorities in this country as well. There's minorities that have to, hey, slow down on your culture, slow down on where you're from, slow down how you talk and how you dress, and adopt how we talk, how we dress in order to be successful here.
yeah.
And no, so I totally agree with you. And I think as society is moving forward, I think bit by bit, I do think that we are acknowledging that and beginning to kind of like shift, right, bit by bit. How fast or how slow that's moving is, I'll leave up to the individual. But I do think that people are becoming aware of that. Like, wait a minute. So I'll give you an example on this project that I was in for a client. We were doing this training project, and it was a major change, right? Major change. And you know, essentially the client was saying, hey, they'll just get over it. They're upset with it, but just tell them to stop being babies. We're making this change. It makes sense to make this change, right? And
Mhm.
my approach was to say, hey, we need to go in and honor their emotions, honor their frustration, their resentment, their anxiety first, before we, make this change, or they're going to be totally resistant to it, right? They're like, no, we're not going to do that, right? And so my approach actually was very, very successful. When I went to go train this audience, I specifically said, "Hey, let's address the elephants in the room. Let's talk about how you're feeling anxious, resentful, upset with all this change going on, compared to other trainers who just went in and just went straight ahead, like, just get over it. We're going to talk about this, right?" Two
Mhm.
totally different reactions to the audience, and so I think bit by bit, people are understanding that it makes business sense to honor the feminine, honor the emotional side of humans.
I think that's total. I'm seeing that happening slowly, as well. Like, just the ubiquity of networking, just through recognizing, like, even social media and networking, groups and stuff is really recognizing that there's an importance to relationships. And some of the networking groups that I've connected with are talking a lot about forming relationships without trying to sell anybody anything,
Mhm.
because it's really about the relationships. And I think that is honoring more of the feminine energy. In some of these startups and venture capitalists, I think, are starting to recognize as well that relationships are important, and yet they're still an old boys club mostly. And so they're recognizing that there's an importance in relationships, but how quickly they start making the leap to seeing women entrepreneurs get the venture capital dollars might take a little while. Like, I went to an event not long ago, and there's a lot of young men in the room with startup ideas, and you don't see as many women because there's still, this, it's taking a little longer for those things to develop. But I do think it's happening in little ways. I guess what I'm and so that needs to happen a little bit more, but I have a couple thoughts. Let me share two. One is that I think a woman who's in a corporate environment um, oftentimes might feel as though she has to hamper or dampen some of her feminine nature in order to function within that environment, because the feminine nature is tied to sexuality. And in order to be taken seriously, a lot of women feel that they have to minimize that component of who they are in order to function in that environment. And I'm not, I don't want to make big generalizations, but I do think that happens. And even if you look at things like government and politics and boardrooms and things like that, you're not going to necessarily see, the women who are more successful might be a little more masculine in some capacity, um, and less flowing, right? They're not going to look like Stevie Nicks, if you know who Stevie Nicks is, with their cape and their long skirts necessarily, because that's not really accepted in the masculine boardroom dominant culture. Um, and so I think that's a little bit of a challenge in terms of how that shift is going to happen over time in the corporate nature. I mean, obviously, if people are working more from home, it might allow for it a little bit. And then the second area that I think is important to sort of think about these questions are in relationships between men and women, and whether it's dating or long-term relationships and how those energies manifest. So I'm curious if you have any thoughts about those two kind of segments of society, and managing the masculine and the feminine.
Yeah, so I'll focus on relationships because I think we covered the professional a little bit. So
Yeah.
one, I'll say feminine energy and masculine energy, because there are men who are heterosexual who are more feminine, and there are women who are heterosexual who are masculine, who are more masculine, and that there's nothing wrong with that. It's just your unique mix of energy, right? So I like to say feminine and masculine rather than men and women, because there's all kind of relationships and all that stuff.
Right, right, right.
But
Yeah.
as far as how this can play out in relationships is, sometimes I think one of the primary issues in relationships, how this might play out, is depolarization, which is, if you think about it, if you have a magnet that's, when they're opposites, they attract really, really intensely. But when they're have the same type of, of setting, they begin to actually repel each other. And so if you have masculine energy and you have feminine energy, but the feminine begins to kind of shift to kind of be a little more masculine, and the masculine energy shifts to be a little more feminine, and then that depolarization, they actually kind of repel each other. It's less attraction, right? And so if you have feminine energy that is told be masculine, be masculine, be masculine, be masculine, then you're going to have a depolarization. And then if you go into society too and say toxic masculinity, be less masculine, less masculine, less masculine, and then you're going to have those depolarizations, right? So it's and these are all societal pressures here. And so I think honoring it, learning to honor and reawaken the feminine, and be 100%. If you're feminine, be feminine, and to honor balanced masculinity. And if you're masculine, be masculine. I think is one of the key components of a successful relationship. And I said this to my wife a couple of weeks ago. I said, I think from an energetic perspective, I think the feminine's responsibility is to trust the masculine, And I think the masculine's responsibility is to be trustworthy. And I think that is where we start getting issues, because you have a whole bunch of masculine energy who is not trustworthy at all. And then, you traumatize the feminine learns to not trust the masculine, which just creates a whole bunch of issues.
I totally agree with you, and that's where I guess I'm interested in intimacy education and thinking about this kind of work with relationships, because um, there's a lot of repair that needs to be done. And so when two people are interacting, whether it's just getting to know each other and dating, or whether it's, having a relationship for a while and hitting a rough patch, I think that they're not only bringing that situation they're in, but they're bringing their families and all the stuff they've learned as children and, upbringing into that. And they're also bringing the entire culture and what we assume about men and women and these sorts of energies into that situation. And so you're carrying all of the weight of all these other things a lot of times. I'm not saying you have to, but I think a lot of people are, especially if they're not doing some deeper spiritual work. I think, deeper spiritual work really allows you over time to sort of shed some of that, so that you're just honoring and being authentic to, like, this is the experience I'm in. This is where I am. And I'm a person, you're a person, and we're connecting as two people. But I think oftentimes that's not what's happening, because we have a lot of barriers based on sex and sexuality, and a lot of cultural things coming into play in our relationships. So I totally agree with you about this issue of trust, because I think not many of us would maybe say this outright, and it might take, I don't know, some people it might take a minute, but I think the sexiest thing is trust. But for me, the sexiest thing is really trust. But finding a person that is deserving of that kind of trust is challenging, because if I'm in a society where it's a masculine paradigm, and I'm an empowered, confident woman who loves my femininity, but also needs to operate in ways that are masculine in order to function in a society and have both of these pieces, then how do I determine if somebody is trustworthy when it comes to a situation like dating, especially in the mess of online dating that's out there? Now, I have been married, so I can tell you that trust is crucial in a relationship.
Mhm.
And um, and so I'm definitely more aware of that importance now than I maybe was when I got married at 24. But I think men and women are both struggling right now, and we're talking about heterosexual relationships, because I think, other kinds of relationships are worthy of conversation as well. But in terms of a heterosexual male woman, male female kind of relationship, the rules, I don't know if the rules apply that used to apply, and I don't know if they should apply that way, if we're continuing to spiritually evolve as people. um, Tell me what your thoughts are.
So I will toss this out there. One, I got married at 22, and so I totally skipped the whole online dating world. I can't really speak to some of that stuff right now, but I will say this from my walk. Before I kind of begin to understand what unconditional love was and integrate that into my experience, I kind of was trying to only give as much as I didn't want to give so much of myself that if something happened, I would like be destroyed, right? Like, oh,
Right.
if my wife left me or something happened to me or she cheated or this or that, I'd just be destroyed. And so I would only give as much, I would almost have like one foot in, one foot out, right? And so even though my wife didn't do anything to be untrustworthy, I inherently wasn't able to trust fully because I was scared, right? Because I was afraid of what would happen if I trusted 100% and then that trust was betrayed, right?
Yeah.
But unconditional love does not require anything. It doesn't ask anything. It doesn't demand anything. It says, I love you without conditions. Now, you can act crazy and maybe our relationship changes, but the love for you is unconditional. It's exactly how God, source, higher power, whatever you want to call it, loves I believe, loves us, right? So this whole thing that like, oh, you pissed God off, you did that, that I think is stupid. I think it makes no sense at all, right? Because it's unconditional love. People equate their love of their parents with the love of God, right? And so their parents would say, oh, you didn't behave, you behaved this kind of way, which I didn't like. So I'm going to punish you, or I'm going to like, withdraw love from you. And you assume the same thing about God, which is stupid in my opinion.
Yeah, I
I'm
agree. Yeah.
but unconditional love does not ask anything, require anything, demand anything at all. So unconditional love in this marriage is to say, hey, I love you regardless. If you act crazy, if you do this, if you leave me, if you cheat, the love is just, it just is what it is, because I am love, and my desire is to experience and give love, and that's it. My love is not dictated by your actions. And when you really begin to integrate that, trust becomes almost a byproduct of that, because it's just like, if you're going to act crazy, if you're going to cheat, you're going to cheat. There's nothing that I can do about it. And all I can do is be who I am, which is love, which is unconditional love. And obviously that's a lot easier said than done, and that's something you have to like work at and integrate. And some days I do it better than other days, but for me, that was kind of that's when the switch flipped for me, when I said, wait a second, unconditional love. That's what I choose to embody in this relationship and in my life.
I'm totally with you on that. And I've had my own journey of kind of considering what that is. And I guess I have a question about, love versus partnership in that regard, because um I definitely did not love unconditionally. I didn't know that until later. And I was like, oh, I guess I didn't love unconditionally. And that might have been a piece that was missing. Sort of, maybe there was a part like what you were talking about that was holding back. Um, and I think my instincts were probably right, to be honest with you, in terms of why that would have held back. But I do think there might have to be a distinction between love, which I could feel for I can maybe see the whole of someone and still love them, but do I want to engage in a partnership, which is sort of like a contract, and
Mhm.
there's terms, right? And so those might be different questions. I mean, once you're married, you're sort of in that contract. But for me, thinking about whether I would want to engage in a relationship that intimate again, there's those questions of like, okay, I find now that because I unconditionally love myself through my spiritual progress, I unconditionally love myself. I've seen all the layers, and I do. And it's much easier to love somebody
Mhm.
unconditionally. But then the question of whether I want to enter into a partnership that is sort of akin to a contract, would I really want to get legal involvement in that? Those are other kinds of questions, I think. You agree?
Rephrase the question for me, because I'm not super sure exactly what you're asking.
So okay, so my understanding on my spiritual path is, what I learned is the more that I loved myself, the more that I saw who I was and loved myself, regardless of any decisions I made, regardless of any mistakes I thought I made, the more I learned that I could love other people unconditionally as well. And I could see that by looking inward, you used Jung earlier, when you look inward, you awaken. And so through that awakening process in myself, I learned, oh, I can love many people. I don't have to look at a romantic partnership or a romantic relationship as the be all end all of my existence. There's multiple kinds of love, and I can love people in various ways at various levels, um,
Hmm.
without expecting anything in return necessarily. I can love them just for who they are, because I can see them, because now that I know myself and I can love myself, it's easier to love others.
Hmm.
But if I'm going to bring someone into my life and form a bond that links my family and their family, right? And that connects my professional network with their professional network, and that shares, my history and my finances, and becomes a legal agreement and contract. That to me feels like a different decision. Does that make sense? That's a
Yeah, I
different
mean,
decision to me.
Yeah, I mean, specifically with marriage, I think you have to go back and identify what marriage was created for.
Mhm.
Historically, there's probably a lot more years where marriage was not kind of a love-based thing. It was more of a business transaction, right?
Right,
And so as society, we have this kind of like fantasized, romanticized thing of like, oh, you meet someone, you fall in love, you get married, you're happy, forever after. But if we look at the divorce rate, I mean, the U.S. divorce rate is over 50%. I mean, I think it's significantly over 50%. And the people that are married, the rest of them aren't have the time of their lives. Some of them are just tolerated or just miserable. And so with and if I look at something and say, hey, there's over a 50% failure rate, I need to look at that and say, let's make some adjustments because the way
right,
this is done traditionally does not work. And so even me and my wife, when we first got married, I told her from Jump Street, like, hey, I am not interested in a traditional marriage. The only people that makes the rules for our relationship is us. I don't
right.
care what your parents think. I don't care what my parents think. I don't care what society says. What works for us? What's going to make us happy? And so it's really up to you. It's up to you. How
Thank
do you
you.
how do you want to love and be loved? And what do you want that to look like? There's no right or wrong answers. There's no obligations. So it's like whatever works for you. I think be self-aware enough to say, okay, these are the actions that I've taken and these are the results that I've gotten. Do I like these results or not? If I don't, then let me adjust. If I do, then let me think, then fine. But it's like, yeah, I don't think there's any obligations or anything that you have to do, or have to be, despite what society says.
I agree. As long as people are having that healthy communication though, right? Because I think that a big issue is now I don't want to put you on the spot, but you said once we got married, I had that conversation. Now to me, that's a conversation you have before you get married. And I don't know. Sometimes we don't know what kind of conversations to even have because we're not really taught how to do that. We're not taught how to talk about relationships and intimacy and sexuality. And you know i i I was not a big fairy tale person, but it still seeped in that it was the wedding, and the idea of the partner for my life was so beautiful. But the actual struggles of what a married couple faces, there's such beauty in marriage that you stick it out, that you know somebody so well, that you're with them every day. I mean, there's a real beauty in it. But the struggle of it is not often talked about. It's not often addressed. People are much more comfortable presenting a certain front to everybody else, and what goes on behind closed doors is totally unknown and not really discussed. And I found that in my own life, and no one would have guessed that me and my ex-husband would have been having issues. We looked like the closest people, and it was a real challenge for me to even talk to anybody else about the struggles I was having because I didn't want to be disloyal. I'm a very loyal person, so I didn't want anybody to think differently of my partner if I was going to share certain things. And so there's a lot of struggles I think that are faced with marriage, and that's a whole other conversation. But I do think that there's something different about love, which is free and open and not needing anything in return, and a decision to embark on a partnership where there are expectations, and there have to be. You know what I'm saying? You see the difference?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I agree with you. I think the core comes down to tell the truth. Have the courage to tell the truth. Your truth, and I think starts with you. For me, learning to. I mean, first of all, I didn't really know at first, right? There took some work to kind of dig down deep and figure out what is your truth.
Yeah,
And then there was my conditioned belief systems. So even though when I discovered my truth, I had my conditioned beliefs that said I shouldn't think that, I shouldn't feel that. And
yeah,
then when you accept that, then you share it with your partner, and then they have their conditioned stuff. So it's like there's this process, but it
yeah.
it really comes down to, I think, digging down deep and discovering what is your truth, and then if you have your reactions to those truths, begin to do the work to understand, well, why am I having those reactions? Who told me that? Because there's so many things that I believed about relationships, about God, about all this stuff that I realized when I thought about it. That's just some random person told me that. I just heard that and I just integrated that into my reality, and it wasn't an ultimate truth. It was just some guy just said it. And if a belief doesn't serve you, then I really think it's something that we should consider adjusting. So if your beliefs about love, about relationships, about masculinity, femininity, whatever, aren't serving you from the perspective of you're not happy, you're struggling, you're confused, you're anxious, you're angry all the time, then I think it's time to begin to examine and adjust those beliefs, whatever you end up coming to.
I totally agree with you. And so a foundation, because I know we have to wrap up, but a foundation, I would say, based on what you're saying, and I totally agree with this, is communication. But in order to be a good communicator, you have to do your own soul searching, right? You have to do your own work and develop your own practice where you know what's in you, you know how you feel. Because if some of us have dealt with an upbringing of abuse or trauma or other sorts of events in life, we might not even know how we feel because we may not have never felt entitled to our feelings. And I know people who have gone through trauma that they don't know that they can own their feelings. They don't think they're allowed, and they've never had opportunities and freedom to have those feelings, right? So much of the work is about, let me know myself so that when I do speak, I'm speaking with clarity and I'm speaking with truth. Because otherwise, a lot of your conversations end up just being reactions. And sometimes you're kind of changing what you say because there's an assumption about how the other person might respond or what they might be thinking, rather than kind of giving yourself that distance. A lot of people have codependent relationships too. So it's like, I don't know where I end and you begin. And that's not healthy, right? So when you do that individual soul work, you're saying, I honor who I am, I'm listening, I'm getting in tune with who I am. And then when I speak, at least I can also listen to somebody else, and I can honor where they are, and I can honor that we're two separate people trying to work together. And I think that's the beauty of a relationship.
Yeah, I agree. I totally agree. I think it comes down to working through that trauma, right? Whether that's therapy, 12-step groups, support groups, whatever it is, to don't just accept, the symptoms of your trauma, really work through them and kind of begin to dig deep. I think that's the way forward for me. I think that's the way forward for that I've seen, at least for a lot of people.
Yeah, it's really helpful that way. Okay, so I feel like we could talk about this conversation, these kinds of topics on and on. So I hope that we can do that again. But in the meantime, thank you so much for joining me for this,
Yeah,
Julius.
you're quite welcome. Yeah, let me know. I mean, I think this is fun. I think it's good to get this stuff recorded. I think that your audience is going to benefit a lot from you having these conversations. I think they're very much needed now.
Yeah, I do too. Thank you so much. Okay, so have a great day.
All right, you too.